October 7th, 2004. The guests on this cruise ship have gathered for their nightly game of Texas Hold'em poker in the ship's casino. Seated at the table is Sally Harper. Sally is a savvy businesswoman and a shrewd poker player. She also loves to win. But while good fortune might be smiling on Sally tonight, her trip will soon be marred by tragedy. A tragic death at sea. Was it an accident? Or is there a murderer on board? Could someone else be next? How many people will die? October 4th, 2004, on board a luxury 5-star cruise ship. It spans 615 feet, with a crew of 130, taking care of 1,712 passengers, all preparing for the trip of a lifetime, traveling from Los Angeles, California to New York City. The LA to New York trip is one of the longest and most luxurious routes a cruise ship can take. And while most ships go from one port to another, this cruise is epic. It goes from Los Angeles to New York, with stops throughout Central America and the Caribbean, in countries like Mexico, Costa Rica, Trinidad, Aruba, and Barbados. This is an expensive, once-in-a-lifetime trip for people who want to enjoy the ocean and explore the best of Central America. One of these passengers is Sally Harper, a 37-year-old sales executive from Hollywood. Sally is a California girl whose life has unfortunately been marked by personal tragedy. Born in Malibu, Sally spends her days as the head cheerleader at high school, but spends her evenings playing poker with her salesman dad and his friends from the car dealership.
So this really instilled almost like a gambler's instinct in Sally, where she's got a really good feeling for when to bluff, how to bluff, that so-called poker face. This is something that you could almost say it's in her blood.
Sally was a lot like her father. Both were great talkers and great people.
Sally adores her father, and while he spends a lot of nights working, he also dreams about taking her on a big vacation one day. But Sally's father never gets the chance, as he's unfortunately killed in a car crash her senior year. After her father's death, Sally can't afford to go to college, so she gets a job at the same car dealership her father used to work at.
Just like her dad, Sally's very talented with selling, with getting to know people, with forming that quick relationship, and this suits her very well at the car dealership. It's not easy to sell cars, but Sally excels at it, and soon she's the top salesperson at the dealership.
It was great to see her develop skills in sales. Her father would have been so proud.
Sally's success eventually lands her a position as a sales executive at a national beverage and alcohol supply company.
She's at the top of her game, but she's too busy to really socialize or meet anyone.
One of Sally's clients is Tom Brisbois, a hotel manager who quickly falls in love with the beautiful sales executive.
Sadly, after just a few years of marriage, Tom passes away from complications from diabetes.
Losing her father and her husband, I really don't know how she managed.
Sally's a woman who's in her late 30s, and She's lost her parents, she's widowed. She's come to realize that maybe life is too short and she just wants to get out there.
She starts researching cruise vacations, something she always wanted to do with her dad, always wanted to do with her husband, and never got the opportunity. This could be, however, the first step to a new life, a new reality for Sally as she moves past the grieving into a life of her own.
The 21-day cruise would let Sally see Central America and then dock in New York for her to meet with clients, a perfect mix of business and pleasure. But Sally gets excited when she spots the ship's gambling hall on her first day at sea. Sally strides in with confidence, perhaps with the feeling that her father might be watching over her.
One of the attractions on cruise ships is the ability to gamble where you may not be able to closer to home. So Sally likes to play poker, and this cruise ship offers her the ability to do that once they get out of port.
At the Texas Hold'em table, Sally meets the other guests, including Paul Shepard, a 27-year-old personal trainer.
Texas Hold'em is an interesting game because it's based on psychology and strategic betting. You have to try and get inside the other player's mind and guess what they're going to do in order to play what you're going to do next.
As the only woman at the table, Sally immediately draws attention from other players. But Sally knows this seemingly innocent conversation is more about sizing her up as a player and competitor.
Perhaps the other players were underestimating Sally. She's this beautiful woman, they don't know her, she sits down, they think, easy mark. And the tables turn when they start to realize how good a player she really is.
After a couple hours of playing, Sally gets an opportunity to win big.
Sally gets lucky with a pair of queens, and after pushing the other players to bet big, she goes all in. Now they have to match her to stay in the game.
Sally's big bet pays off, and she wins almost $1,000.
Unlike other gamblers, Sally knows when to call it quits, so she leaves the table with a lot of her opponent's money, which of course doesn't make anyone else very happy.
But even with her good fortune, Sally's trip is still a melancholy experience.
There's an old saying that says, wherever you go, there you are. And this is what's happening with Sally. She was hoping that she could escape her sadness by going on this wonderful cruise, but it's still there. Then there's a distraction. She notices a commotion on deck, and she can tell instantly that something is very wrong.
Sally is horrified to see a man drowning in the water. Will the crew be able to react in time to save him? Sally Harper is a California-born sales executive taking the cruise of a lifetime, traveling from California to New York while making stops through Central America. Sally is a fierce competitor on both the sales floor and the poker table, but her tenacity doesn't make her the most popular person on board the ship. Sally's vacation takes a morbid turn when she hears people screaming that a man has gone overboard. Ship Captain Jim Irvine hears the ship's alarm and immediately orders the engines stopped. The crew acts quickly, throwing 2 lifebuoys overboard and launching a rescue dinghy to try to save him. But as the crew gets closer, the cruise guests are horrified to watch as the man doesn't try to save himself. Instead, his body relaxes as he lets himself float face down in the water. When the crew finally gets to him, they're too late. He's already drowned. The crew recover the man's body, along with a large brown suitcase of his belongings. But when they carry him on board, Sally breaks down in tears. The man is identified as Paul Shepard, the man Sally had developed a friendship with during the cruise.
When Sally's friend Paul turned up dead, it must have devastated her. I don't know how much heartache can one person take.
Remember, Sally's experienced a lot of tragedy in her life, and this is just one more. This was supposed to be her chance to get away from that, and here is another dead man that she knew. So she's devastated.
Captain Irvine orders his crew to check if there's any security footage of what happened to Paul. Meanwhile, he takes Sally into his office to console her and to see if she might have any more information about his death.
Sally tells the captain that she met Paul during the poker game. He was a good player, but he had to tell. Whenever he thought he had a good hand, he would take a sip of his drink. She used this against him during her big win at the end.
But after leaving with her winnings, Paul follows her out of the gambling hall.
Paul flags her down, and at first Sally thinks that he's going to want to win his money back. But he doesn't. He just congratulates her on her great playing and asks her to go out for a drink with him. While flattered by this young, handsome man's attention, Sally's still grieving the loss of her husband, and she's just not ready. But she does say she's happy to make a new friend if he wants to keep her company, and that's just fine with Paul.
Sometimes people have natural walls that they build up and they don't connect easily with everyone, but eventually when you find somebody that you have a connection to, it's easy to let your guard down, and sometimes you can find yourself in trouble.
Sally explains to Captain Irvine how her relationship with Paul developed over the days of the cruise. Paul told her that he was a personal trainer and he booked his spot on the ship to get away from work for a while.
It's a whirlwind of emotion for poor Sally. Here's this cute, charming man, and he seems to be interested in her. Ordinarily, this would be the dream of a lot of women to meet someone like that, especially when they have something in common, like they do with their card playing. But in this case, she's still grieving the loss of her husband, and she's just not ready.
Their friendship blossoms slowly over the next week. They start eating meals together, going for walks around the ship, and exploring the different cities the ship docks in. The two also spend time playing some friendly games of poker with the other guests.
While Sally always knows when to call it quits, it's not the same with Paul. Paul seems to be addicted to gambling. As he loses, he gets more and more obsessed with getting his money back. And sadly, as he does, he also drinks more, which impairs his judgment further. Sally wants to say something to him, but they don't know each other well enough yet, so she just goes to bed and leaves him to his game.
Sally tells Captain Irvine that the night before Paul's death, she found him in the gambling hall.
By this time, Sally's thinking they're friends. She thinks very warmly of Paul, so she finds him playing what looks to be a casual game of cards with some friends and invites him to dinner. But he snaps at her. She sees a totally different side of his personality. Hurt and offended, she decides to just leave him to his game, and she goes to dinner by herself.
Unfortunately, that was the last time Sally saw Paul alive. Captain Irvine thanks Sally for her testimony, but he'll need more information to try to figure out what Paul was doing from the time he left the gambling hall last night to his going overboard this afternoon. The captain asks Sally if she thinks there'd be any reason for Paul to commit suicide, wondering if he perhaps lost too much money gambling.
She rejects that immediately. He obviously could have afforded this expensive vacation, and the casinos on cruise ships have rules about how much you're allowed to bet. So he was never betting more than he could afford to lose. She really doesn't think that he's the type of person that would throw himself overboard just because he lost a few $100s.
Then Captain Irvine asks if she can think of anyone who might have reason to throw Paul overboard. This time, Sally isn't so sure.
Sally tells the captain that she doesn't know of anyone else who would want Paul dead, but on the other hand, she doesn't really know him, and he could have secrets that she's not aware of.
Captain Irvine knows that a man has gone overboard, but he doesn't know why. It's an important distinction, and the difference between a death by misadventure and a murder. Because there's no medical examiner on board, There's no way to tell when Paul's true cause of death occurred. It could be the drowning, or it could be something else in his system. With 2 weeks left in the ship's voyage, Paul's death is a mystery that Captain Irvine is going to have to keep working at if he's going to solve. But the conversation is interrupted by a crew member who enters with a shocking discovery.
It seems that Paul was keeping secrets all along. Hidden inside his suitcase in a secret compartment is a small handgun and a large quantity of heroin.
When you're getting onto the ship, you and your luggage pass through various levels of security, and your luggage is searched to make sure you're not bringing contraband or weapons onto the boat. This is to ensure the safety of all passengers. Even though you pass through multiple levels of security when boarding a ship, it's not unheard of for a passenger to be able to smuggle something illegal onto the boat.
For Sally and Captain Irvine, the facts surrounding Paul's death just got a lot more complicated. Sally Harper is a sales executive taking the cruise of a lifetime, traveling from California to New York while making stops in Central America. But after the tragic death of her husband, Sally is excited to meet Paul Shepard, a handsome personal trainer. The two hit it off on the poker table, which leads to budding friendship. But sadly, their relationship is also cut short when Sally spots Paul's body recovered from the water after an apparent drowning accident. But things get even more complicated when a crew member discovers a handgun and a large amount of heroin hidden inside Paul's luggage. Captain Irvine is especially angry because guns and narcotics are both illegal aboard cruise ships. This means that Paul somehow managed to get both past ship security.
It would be a horrible thing for someone to be able to smuggle a weapon on a cruise ship because everyone is the proverbial sitting ducks. There's nowhere for them to go. So what if Paul had pulled out this weapon? He would have had a crowd of 1,700 people with nowhere to escape to.
As the person who seems to know Paul the best, Captain Irvine asks Sally if she knows anything about this dangerous side of his personality. But Sally has no idea.
However, even though things look bad for Paul, until the police can dust the bag and the gun for prints, there's no proof that it either belonged to him or that he even knew it was in his suitcase. Since it was hidden inside, someone could have used him as a mule. It could have been a plant.
Captain Irvine decides he needs to question the other people who might have seen where Paul went after the poker game the night before, and asks Sally for some of the people she remembers playing with. One of the players she remembers is Victor D'Angelo.
There's something a bit off about Victor. The captain can't put his finger on it, but there's something about Victor that just gets on his nerves right away, especially when the man expects to smoke a cigar in his office. He's flashy, he's smooth, he's a bit of a high roller. Something is not adding up for the captain.
But Captain Irvine is shocked when Victor confirms that not only was Paul carrying a firearm, but he almost came close to using it.
Victor loves to gamble. In fact, he booked a trip on this cruise ship just because of its casino. He admits that he was one of the people who lost quite a bit of money to Sally, but he doesn't mind. It's all in good fun for him.
Over the course of the trip, Victor notices Sally and Paul's developing relationship. But while Sally is smart enough to leave the poker table early every night, Paul always stays. And while most people don't like to lose, Victor says he could tell that Paul hated to lose.
Just like Sally, Victor also picked up on Paul's habit of drinking more heavily whenever he lost and betting more aggressively.
But Victor tells Captain Irvine that last night was different.
Paul's on this really big losing streak. He's getting more and more stressed out about it. He wants to bet even more, way more than the casino will allow him to do. He's feeling really desperate at this point in time.
Victor tells Captain Irvine that he's a California real estate mogul, so he knows a mark when he sees one.
Victor invites Paul and some of the others back to his own cabin for a game with no holds barred, no limits. The captain is really surprised that Victor would be so open with these revelations, given the fact that it's against the crew's rules. It's a serious offense and could get him thrown off.
With the game moved to Victor's cabin, Paul gets off to a hot start. Unfortunately, this encourages him to get even more aggressive.
Victor can see that Paul's not in a great frame of mind. He's drunk, he's getting tired, he's getting sloppy, he's not in a good mood. So Victor decides to take advantage of that. He starts baiting him. He lets Paul win a few hands just to get his confidence back up. But then he starts playing for real.
It doesn't take long for Victor to start winning, bringing Paul down to just a few chips. Before long, Paul builds up a debt of over $10,000. Desperate to win his money back, Paul announces he wants to play one more hand for double or nothing.
Victor wisely asks Paul for some collateral to prove that he actually has the money. Paul tries to assure Victor that he's good for it. He says that he can contact these people in Los Angeles that will supposedly wire him the money.
Victor agrees to play one more hand.
Victor explains that at this point in the game, Paul was into him for $20,000. He lost it all in one big hand. Victor said he was starting to feel sorry for the kid and was about to apologize when suddenly Paul explodes and pulls a gun on him. Victor right away notices how dangerous this situation is. Paul is clearly not in his right mind, so he decides that $20,000 really isn't worth dying for, and he lets Paul go.
Thankfully, this seems to relax Paul, who drunkenly stumbles out of the room. Captain Irvine is stunned by Victor's story, and it raises more questions. The captain asks Victor why, if the debt was settled, would Paul decide to jump off the ship the next day.
Victor suggests that perhaps Paul had more psychological issues than just welching on gambling debts.
But Captain Irvine doesn't buy it. If Paul wanted to commit suicide, why wouldn't he use the gun in his room? And what's more, why didn't Victor report that Paul had threatened him with a gun in the first place?
Victor laughs and says, well, I was going to, but I decided to sleep in instead.
Captain Irvine can tell that there's something Victor isn't telling him. Is it possible that it was Victor who lost the card game and took it out on Paul to avoid paying the debt? And why would a personal trainer bring a gun on board along with the cash to be able to gamble tens of thousands of dollars? Combined with the heroin, it's pretty clear that Paul may not be who he says he was, and Victor may be hiding the truth. For Captain Irvine, this case is only just beginning. Sally Harper is on what she hoped would be the vacation of a lifetime, only for her friend Paul Shepard to end up dead of an apparent suicide. Paul's death occurs the morning after an apparent high-stakes poker game, where he lost over $20,000 to Victor D'Angelo, a wealthy California real estate mogul. But something doesn't smell right to Captain Jim Irvine, especially after crew members recover a gun and a large amount of heroin inside Paul's luggage, which was also thrown overboard. As the ship docks in Aruba to give passengers a chance to enjoy the beach, the traumatized Sally stays confined to her room.
Paul's death hit Sally really hard. She's lost too many people in her life. Even though she didn't know Paul that well, he seemed like a nice guy. Or was he? The contents of his suitcase really make her start doubting herself. Was she a good judge of character? How come she didn't get the sense that Paul might be dangerous or hiding something that important?
Captain Irvine knows that he has to figure out how Paul died to make sure there isn't a murderer on board the ship. Shortly after, a crewman comes in with the answer in the form of security footage, revealing the true cause of Paul's death. The captain watches as Paul steps onto the deck carrying his suitcase. He looks visibly ill, but but there's also an odd expression of calm on his face.
Sometimes there's a phenomenon that can happen with people who've decided to end their lives. Since they've made that decision, they become comfortable with it, they've accepted it, they may appear to actually have improved, to be in better spirits or happier, a bit calmer than usual. This is what we might have been seeing with Paul on the CCTV footage.
Paul takes in the view one last time, and then after making sure the coast is clear, he tosses his suitcase overboard. But then, in the moment of truth, Paul gets emotional. Then he jumps into the water.
Ships have very sophisticated video surveillance systems, and so when somebody is seen on surveillance video to commit suicide, the investigation may not have to continue beyond that.
It's disturbing video, but confirms that Paul's death was indeed a suicide, which forces Captain Irvine to consider if Victor was really telling the truth, but then raises a whole list of other questions.
We don't really know much about Paul, who he was, what he was running from, what his demons were. We don't understand why he would have taken his luggage with him if he was prepared to commit suicide. There's just a lot about this case that isn't adding up.
The answer is revealed when Captain Irvine makes a call to the Los Angeles police to report Paul's death. Thanks to a conversation with a local detective, Captain Irvine learns that Paul Shepard's background isn't as clean as it seems.
The LAPD had been watching him for some time and had discovered that Paul was working with a major organized crime family in Los Angeles.
But Captain Irvine's world is rocked when he learns that one of the leaders of the Buffetti Mafia is none other than Victor D'Angelo.
Victor's not only connected to the crime family that Paul works for, he's one of his bosses. So this would explain why, if Paul didn't know this, he felt comfortable pulling a gun on Victor. It could explain why he wanted to end his own life. This gambling debt isn't going to go away. If anyone was going to kill him over money, it would be someone like Victor. This is really looking more like suicide to Captain Irvine. He realizes that Paul would have been in a very bad state when he woke up that morning, realizing that Victor's probably going to kill him for that money.
But what about the gun? Why would he bring it with him on the trip, along with the heroin and the large amounts of cash? Was Paul planning to sell the drugs along the Central American coast? The money might not have been his to begin with, which means Paul had lost money belonging to a criminal element. That's potentially a death sentence. Captain Irvine realizes that while Victor D'Angelo might not have murdered Paul outright, the fear Paul felt could have been enough for him to end up dead.
One of the difficulties with cruise ships is when a crime occurs, there's really no police on board. So while the captain is doing his best, he's not a trained detective. He's just trying to do what he knows how to do. Short of calling in the FBI and getting them to fly in, there's nothing else he can do until law enforcement arrives. And the captain isn't the type of person to just sit idle. He wants to try and help as much as he can.
Cruise ships don't come with a crime lab that would let you test for fingerprints or DNA. Any questions that Captain Irvine has will have to wait until they dock 2 weeks later in New York. As a precaution, Captain Irvine decides to shut down the casino for the rest of the cruise. The captain decides to keep talking with the police to see if he can dig up any verifiable connection between Victor and Paul, when suddenly Sally storms into his office.
Sally tells the captain that she overheard Victor and his friends actually laughing about Paul's death and saying he was better off doing it himself. This makes her so upset she just had to leave the room.
Captain Irvine calms Sally down and explains that while his investigation is still ongoing, he does have suspicions that Paul's suicide was prompted or potentially coerced by Victor's ties to the Buffetti Mafia.
When investigators are looking into someone's death, they would frequently look at past relationships and business dealings. So if someone was to have a connection to organized crime, that may definitely come into play in terms of determining why someone took their own life.
Sally is taking this very hard. She's very upset and she demands to know what the captain is going to do about this. Unfortunately, the captain's hands really are tied until they get to New York. He's not law enforcement. He has no authority to arrest Victor. Plus, there's the footage that proves that Paul jumped on his own. Just because Victor and Paul are members of the same crime family is no proof that Victor had anything to do with Paul's death.
Captain Irvine advises Sally to stay away from Victor for the rest of the trip. Until they can prove any form of foul play, Paul's death will remain classified as a suicide. For Sally, the thought of Paul's death being in vain is one final heartbreak. For Captain Irvine, the case leaves him feeling frustrated and powerless. As the ship stops in Barbados on October 14th, Captain Irvine realizes he hasn't seen Sally outside of her cabin for a couple days. So he decides to send a crew member to check on her and invite her to dinner. Staff member Ryan Norris knocks on Sally's door and at first doesn't get an answer. But then Sally opens the door with a smile, saying she'd be happy to accept the captain's invitation. As the day goes on, Captain Irvine tries to keep the mood light and give passengers the experience they paid for. But as passengers depart and explore Bridgetown, the captain notices Victor and his friends leaving the ship.
Seeing Victor walking free, leaving the ship, gives the captain a bad feeling.
1 hour later, Captain Irvine stops at Sally's cabin, ready to pick her up on the way to the dining hall. But when he knocks on the door, he doesn't get an answer. He finds the door unlocked. Upon entry to Sally's room, the captain is horrified to find her dead on the cabin floor. Sally Harper is enjoying the vacation of a lifetime, only for her friend Paul Shepard to end up dead of an apparent suicide. Victor D'Angelo, a card shark with known ties to the mafia, had beaten Paul in a poker game the night before, leaving him $20,000 in debt to the mob. Sally tells Captain Jim Irvine that she overheard Victor and his friends laughing about Paul's death and saying that it was good he did it himself. A few days later, the ship docks in Barbados, where the captain watches Victor and his friends leave the ship. Then, with just 4 days left in their 21-day voyage, the captain invites Sally for dinner to try to cheer her up, only to find her dead on the cabin floor. It's a tragic end to a lifetime of heartbreak. For Captain Irvine, Sally's death is the last straw in his willingness to play by the rules. He resolves to catch Sally's killer, no matter what. Crew member Ryan Norris arrives to discover what Captain Irvine already knows. Captain Irvine and Ryan can't find any evidence of foul play. Sally's body shows no signs of violence. There's no bruising or marks of any kind. It appears that Sally died of natural causes.
The captain has no evidence as to who or what killed Sally, but he has this instinct, this suspicion, that somehow Victor is involved.
But unfortunately for Captain Irvine, his instincts are too late. All that's left in Victor's cabin is a cigar and a handwritten note.
Thanks for a great time, Victor. And he leaves a single cigar just to rub the captain's nose in it.
It's then that Captain Irvine remembers he saw Victor getting off the ship as they were docked in Barbados. Captain Irvine is furious with himself for letting Victor leave the ship.
There was really nothing he could have done. He didn't have the authority to arrest Victor. There were no charges pending against him.
Captain Irvine knows it's a long shot, but he calls the Barbados police to see if they can assist in locating Victor. Since Sally died in the Bridgetown port, the potential crime is technically in their jurisdiction. Captain Irvine can only hope they might be able to stop Victor from getting on a flight back to the U.S. that Bridgetown police put out an APB to keep an eye out for Victor.
No matter how upset Captain Irvine is, the show must go on. There's 1,700 passengers that are also waiting for the cruise to continue. So they must set sail, and the mystery of Sally's death and Victor's whereabouts have to be left to the New York authorities.
But then, a glimmer of hope.
Crew member Ryan Norris shows the captain the cigar that Victor left in his room. He points out the logo on it.
Captain Irvine could make out the logo for the El Fuego Casino, which an online search shows is located in Port of Spain, Trinidad. The Angelo docked in Trinidad a day earlier. Could this be a clue as to Victor's whereabouts?
The captain calls the casino. He reaches the floor manager, and although the floor manager is reluctant at first to give Captain Irvine any information, he finally relents and tells the captain that yes, Victor has been at the casino.
But floor manager Javier Gutierrez is hesitant to reveal information about his clientele. Captain Irvine is desperate for information, so he decides it's time to break a rule. He lies to Javier, claiming that he's an American police officer following up on a murder investigation. He tells the story of Sally's death and asks Javier for any assistance he can provide. Javier agrees to help.
Furthermore, it appears that there was a woman from the cruise that was also at the casino around the same time, and the woman sounds an awful lot like Sally.
Javier says Victor was playing high-stakes poker in the high roller room.
It's a $10,000 buy-in just to get into the room. This is serious money.
Which is why it was such a shock when Sally came in demanding to play one-on-one against Victor.
When I heard Sally went after Victor, I wasn't surprised.
Victor laughs at her at first, but he isn't laughing when Sally suggests raising the buy-in to $50,000 each, amounting to a $100,000 pot for the winner.
Victor agrees to Sally's terms, and the two begin to play. Javier says the game started off very intense. This was not a friendly game. It felt personal.
On the ship, it was all fun and games for Sally. She was having a good time, blowing off steam. But now, at the casino, she's playing to avenge Paul's death. She lures Victor into a trap, letting him gain his confidence, win a few hands, just to see what his tendencies are. But then she goes for the throat.
Within 4 hours, Sally has cleaned Victor out, winning the entire $100,000 pot.
Frequently in a poker game like this, because the stakes are so high and emotions are so high, often these disputes are carried away from the poker table. You would become so angry that you would act out violently.
Instead of just leaving the game this time, Sally's scared for her own safety. So she offers Javier $1,000 to drive her back to the ship. Javier agrees, and during their conversation, this is how he found out who she was. Captain Irvine is stunned by the story. He asks Javier if there's any proof of it, and of course Javier says yes. This is all accounted for in the casino's records.
Captain Irvine thanks Javier for the information and says he'll be in touch if he can manage to track down Victor.
Though the captain has no proof, he's gotten a sense of Sally and figures that she did all of this to avenge Paul's death. Unfortunately, her desire to honor her father and her deceased husband leads her to go back on the ship and ultimately to her own death.
Believing he has a case, Captain Irvine decides to call the FBI for assistance and start a manhunt for Victor D'Angelo. Jim Irvine is the hard-nosed captain of a cruise ship which has been rocked by 2 tragic deaths on board its 21-day voyage from California to New York City. But with no background in law enforcement and no clear evidence confirming any crimes, Captain Irvine has been forced to rely on witnesses' testimony to build a case against Victor D'Angelo, a man with known ties to the mafia. Captain Irvine suspects that both deaths were a result of poker games gone awry with Victor, with Paul Shepard jumping to his death in an apparent suicide after heavy losses. Sally beat Victor in a game worth $100,000, only to be found later dead in her cabin. Captain Irvine suspects Victor as the murderer, but figured it out too late, allowing Victor to escape the ship on a tourist stop in Barbados.
Because Sally and Paul were both American citizens, there is no other recourse for the captain than to contact the FBI and get them involved in the investigation.
The FBI can actually come out to the scene and they would take charge of the investigation.
He calls the FBI, he tells them everything he knows, and he says that even though he may not have direct evidence implicating Victor, he has a very strong intuition that Victor is responsible for both deaths.
Thanks to the investigative work and testimony gathered by Captain Irvine, the FBI agreed to look into the whereabouts of Victor D'Angelo.
The best that the captain can hope for is that Victor will turn up at an airport or somewhere else where the cops can nab him before he escapes. But he knows that this is unlikely. Someone with Victor's crime connections and wealth has an easier chance of escape.
In the end, Captain Irvine is forced to let go of the investigation. His responsibility is to the 1,700 other passengers and crew aboard the ship. So he launches out of Barbados and off to New York. Upon their arrival in New York, Captain Irvine guides the FBI through his entire investigation, along with the cabins for Sally Harper, Paul Shepard, and Victor D'Angelo. Captain Irvine also turns over the gun and narcotics found in Paul Shepard's suitcase, as well as the cigar and note left behind by Victor D'Angelo. All evidence points to Victor D'Angelo, but nobody in the FBI or Barbados police can find him. Unfortunately for Captain Irvine, the facts about Sally's death don't give him any further comfort.
The autopsy determined that the victim died of an apparent poisoning. How she was poisoned is unknown at this point. How the person came to ingest the poison becomes the most important piece of information. Did they do it inadvertently? Was it given to them intentionally? That would ultimately determine whether it was a homicide or just an accident.
I'm going to miss her so much, and her life shouldn't have ended this way.
Paul Shepard's death is confirmed to be caused by drowning, but the medical examiner detects overdose-worthy amounts of heroin in his system as well. For Captain Irvine, the tragedy is overwhelming. He's never able to prove that Victor D'Angelo was responsible for the deaths of Paul or Sally. This cruise was the last time Jim Irvine captained a vessel, and he quietly retired in 2005.
At this point, 15 years have gone by and no arrests have been made.
Unfortunately for both Sally Harper and Paul Shepard, justice still eludes them.